Yeah, yeah, sure. From Latin diurnal, diurnalis, journey, journal, diurnal, all that.
Now I just kind of want to talk to you about language. But we can do that a different time.
Yeah, so we're recording now.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll have to just do so. If we end up posting this, Cal, you can introduce yourself. But this is, I don't know if it'll end up on Randos maybe, but this would be your debut, I guess. And I think it would be great. I actually think it would be great to talk about your background. It's so, and I don't mean this in a negative way at all, but like just very abnormal, at least to me.
Yeah, for sure. I'm an outlier in many respects in terms of how I was brought up, because I was raised Hare Krishna. I don't know if everyone knows who they are necessarily. That is it whether or not it's a cult, that sort of depends on your definition. You might say if it walks like a cult and talks like a cult, or quacks like a cult, then it is one. And in the 80s and 70s, when it really and the 60s, when it took off in America, it was operating like that in many quarters. But the theology itself is quite ancient. It wasn't invented by anyone off the top of their head. It's an old form of, it's a specific monotheistic, more specifically henotheistic form of Hinduism called Gaudiya Vaishnavism that took on its characteristic form, I want to say, in the 16th century under the teachings of a spiritual leader named Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And that's from sort of northeast India, Bengal. But so basically this is Hinduism that accepts converts. Normally Hinduism, like Judaism, is as much ethnic as it is religious. But this is a kind of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, at least under the guruship of the person who brought it here, A.C. Bhaktivedanta, of whom my father is a disciple. It was really more fundamentalist and focused on the religion and the teachings, not so much on like your ethnic background and tribal belonging or anything like that. So basically, I was raised as a kind of white Hindu, but a very specific kind of Hinduism that really emphasized a sort of monotheistic personalism, and which is like the total opposite of what people associate with Hinduism, which is many gods and then an impersonal Brahman or absolute, this was like the total inverse. They have the gods, but the gods are like a finite power compared to the infinitely powerful Vishnu/Krishna. So
seems, it's like it's more of a Christianized. It seems more not the Christianized, but Christian-like, I suppose.
It grew to be very like Christianity, and I think that is because what's that line from C.S. Lewis, especially, well, in his fiction, you see it when he's, talking about Tash and that knight Emeth who's serving Tash. Right. And Aslan says, if you ever did anything truly or rightly, you served me, whether you knew it or not. And then in his what's that book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis says he believes that God uses his secret influence in all religions to steer people toward what in their teachings is most right. And if you take that as a model, then that's actually how I interpret how these people got so close to Christianity despite being so far away from it.
Yeah, like the Tao or something. So, man, you about lured me into just jumping right into universalism there. But what I would love to talk to you guys about, so I've been thinking about this for a while, just free form, and I mentioned this to you earlier, but we could frame it either two ways. You could title it either, what is man? And I mean that, technically, in like a philosophical way, ontologically, what is a man? What is man? Not even mankind, like what is a man? And then, or you could say, what I was thinking is like the illusion of the autonomous free will, or like the autonomous will. So I don't know what, based off of what we've already talked about, or what your guys' initial thoughts of that would be.
I say we just, Michael, why don't you jump in and maybe contribute some of your initial thoughts on these topics?
Sure. So like when you say what is man, that's such a tough thing, right? Because there's I don't even know where to begin. But what when you were talking about that, my initial reaction is to think about, I don't know, my kind of metaphysical conception of man is this sort of meeting place between heaven and earth.
Mhm.
Um, and you kind of see that in the Genesis account of God taking this sort of dust of the earth and then kind of breathing into it. And so that's kind of my, and that seems to me to solve all sorts of philosophical problems about why there is such difficulties with which with would be such a easy simple question. Like it already right there, I think you have a lot of the sort of complexities that we wrestle with in trying to answer that question. So that I don't know if you guys see that as a good starting place, or if you wouldn't want to add to that definition.
That was probably like the maximally compressed or concise starting place. Because that, I mean, symbolically, at like uh, at the highest level of abstraction or lowest level of resolution, whatever you want to, however you want to phrase that, you know, that is what man is. And Luke was sort of touching on that topic earlier in our conversation earlier today, essentially asking, you know, what is it that man does? What is his role in, you know, our overall theological scheme? Is he really just a thing to be manipulated by God until he has, you know, the desired form, and then there's, you know, essentially nothing else left for him to do or be? Because Luke was talking about it in the context of Calvinism.
Yeah, well, so that's been a little bit of this of the. I guess that was the germ that started me thinking about this question, is because you could. I agree that like the meeting of heaven and earth is a very symbolically true thing, but then if you want to break that down, and I mean think about it even in these categories of dualism. So is that like heaven and earth? Is that like materiality, immateriality? So then man has a body, he's got stuff, matter, and then he's also has this immaterial soul thing. And then so you could think of it that way, or you could think of it. And I guess I'll go into Calvinism of why I was saying this earlier in the. And so maybe if we end up posting this, I'll tag the guys I was interacting with. But in the Q&A on the Discord, Christianity Q&A, or questions and answers or something, basic Christianity, I don't know what to say. But we were talking about Calvinism, and I was saying that to me, Calvinism, I don't really understand. I don't know from a Calvinist frame, and I mean, I was you know, as much as a card-carrying Calvinist you could be for a long time, basically my whole life. I don't know how I would answer that question, what is man? Because I think as a Calvinist, like if somebody would ask me that, I would have accepted your answer, Michael, you know, the meeting of heaven and earth. Like that makes sense. I would be like, that's all right. But I would have accepted that as on kind of like a Sunday school level. Like that seems right. You know, God creates man of the dust of the earth, breathes into him life. Sure, that's in the Bible. I accept that. But then if you have to start like parsing that out and fitting it in with your system of theology, I don't think it really makes sense. And this is why, like Sam Adams and I have talked about this, how I think ultimately Calvinism is pantheist, because I guess where I'm trying to think is my bigger frames are kind of monism, dualism, and like this weird semi-dualism, Trinitarianism idea that I talk about a lot. But if man is essentially like this dualism of heaven and earth, matter and materiality, immateriality, on like a Calvinist frame. So this is kind of what started all this. I'll try to summarize it this way: that if man is inherently like on a Calvinist frame, I don't know how a Calvinist would answer what is the image of God in man, and does that have any? Is there a substance to that? Is there anything to it, or is it just a figurative term that we throw on it? Is man? Is that anything that is in a man? Is that something that constitutes a man? Or because I always thought from the Calvinism, there's the elect and non-elect, and essentially the elect are righteous in Christ in almost like an equivalence way, because all of their goodness is filthy rags and evil and bad, and they're totally depraved and they can't do anything good. And so all of this stuff that they do is bad, and in Christ everything is good, but not in like this mystical way that holds together unity and multiplicity. So like in a mystical union with Christ, where we are in Christ, but we are not equivalent to Christ. We're not like, I'm not Jesus, but I am in Christ in some mystical way. I don't know how a Calvinist would make sense of that in a metaphysic.
Yeah, I don't know if Michael is still here, but when you were talking about it in your recording, the part where you talked about how panentheism is able to sort of hold the idea of Christ and us as little Christ, little cells or members in the body of Christ, in a way that preserves aspects of both unity and multiplicity. That was the part where I kind of snapped my fingers and said, this recording is inspired. But I'm not, see, because you're getting at something that is very interesting to me, because I'm interested in Jonathan Edwards, and I've heard that he was called a panentheist. But like from the lips of sort of evangelical Christians, that means something as bad as pantheist. And already I guess you're kind of splitting hairs, or it will sound like you're splitting hairs when you talk about pantheism versus panentheism, although I'm happy to discuss what I think are the differences there between.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me because I remember people having said that if you push the logic of Edwards' theology to its limit, it becomes panentheism. And I never quite entirely understood the linkage there, but it's getting at something deep. It's something that David Bentley Hart has written about, and that's why I got on my phone, and I started seeing if it's on the book of his that I have, where he talks about that basically in the Calvinist scheme, the imagers of God are they're not really differentiated from God at all, and everything is a kind of determinism. Against what is the will of God even distinguished? What is the background against which we can make intelligible sense of God's will versus whose? What is going on in here? It's actually a panentheism in which some kind of internal differentiation is arising from an underlying you used the word UBT earlier, unbound telesis. That's Christopher Langan's concept from the cognitive theoretic model of the universe, so-called, or CTMU for short. But it's his idea. It's like the Tao. It's like in logic, you have X and not X, and underneath you have both X and not X / neither X nor not X. The medium in terms of which you can make distinctions. You can meaningfully distinguish between a predicate and its complement. There has to be something more fundamental than it, from which the two stand out as hypostases or instantiation. And it is a very deep concept, and a lot of people cannot intuitively get it. And so when they read Langan's sort of UBT concept, which is like a Tao that can be named, because he says you can name it, it's like you can identify at least the concept of contradiction. You have a term like, you have a phrase like a car that's red and green all over. You can't conceive that, but on the first order level, you can't conceive that, but on the second order level, you can frame it. You can represent that sentence in words.
Yeah.
And it's like, I can point to contradiction, even if I can't conceive of it on a first order level. I can identify it on a second order level. And that's what Langen is doing with UBT. He's not committing a logical fallacy or making contradiction. He's just identifying that logic itself is defined with reference to contradiction, because logic is the art of reasoning while avoiding what? You've got to be able to say contradiction. You've got to be able to have that concept. It's a concept on a second order level, even if on a first order level it's not intelligible. Yeah, that's the UBT. The UBT has an inherently shifting Tao-like nature, but that doesn't mean you can't actually name it.
Yeah.
But you're getting into a kind of first order, second order distinction there, in my opinion. But I wouldn't claim to fully understand Langen's ideas by any stretch. This is just my sort of understanding.
So to fully concretize that, and then Michael, what do you think? So then would that, I don't know, I'm not like postulating this, but is man then, it feels like this is where like prepositions are important. Man is not God, but is somehow in God. The way that I've always really, and the reason I think this is really important is because I think there's really practical, I think it has really practical ramifications for how certain aspects of understanding broader doctrine and theology play out. Because how you conceive of these things matter, and they do. I think this gets into that all shall be saved and David Bentley Hart a little bit, because, or even like this Rob Bell clip that I sent you guys earlier, is because what you understand man to be or to not be and how all that works has to affect the way that you understand the character of God when you think about things like final punishment and salvation and all those sorts of things. So is man not God, but he's in God in some kind of mystical way where in him we live and move and have our being. So then, because the reason I'm thinking about all these things is that, I mean, a lot of this comes back to hell things, because I think it's reflected in all these. So like on an understanding of eternal conscious torment, there's this, number one, what is being tortured forever? I don't know.
God. Well, no, not God.
Not God.
But the thing is, ultimately, if you're going to posit, see, you kind of need panentheism, I would submit, for the following reason. If you're going to posit God over here, creatures over here, absolute unbridgeable gulf in between, what's the medium under which they're held? And,
right.
and in whose mind is God sitting over here and we're all sitting over there?
Yeah.
What's more ultimate than that is God again.
Yep.
There is no escape from God. There's something that Langen said. He said, "You're not God in the sense." I'm paraphrasing him. He said, "You're not God in the sense of being all powerful and being the big dog at the top, but you are God in the sense that there's nothing else to be." And so of course, it's like you're in God. In God, we live and move and have our being, and God is in you. And that's the only kind of relationship that one can have to God understood as ultimate reality. There's no escape from God. He's in everything. He pervades everything. Everything is. But it's sort of a two-valued logical distinction within a one-valued medium, which is sort of what Langen was talking about when he talked about ultimate reality as a one-valued logic internally simulating a two-valued logic. It's when you follow his, I mean, this guy is trippy, basically. Like,
what do you think about all this stuff, Michael? Because this kind of, all of this in my mind gets at the idea of this. I mean, it's a lot, but like the autonomous will, because when people start talking about like will, this will is necessary for love, or God created other people, and they start talking about libertarian freedom and being able to choose things in a completely free, unrestricted way. That's what I start thinking. I'm like, what is this will? Like, what is it? Like, you're positing it, but I don't think you know what this thing is.
Is Michael still here?
He's here.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
Michael's just more quiet than us.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I can make sense within like very specific areas, but like I feel like the topic at hand is just so far reaching. It's hard to know where to pick in that I can
Narrow it.
grab. Well, I think why you care about this, right, Luke, is your interest in kind of demythologizing the modern myth of individualism, which does across many dimensions kind of imagine this individual that is an island unto himself, and that kind of can pick and choose what's right and kind of decide what to be and how to feel and what is beautiful and what is not beautiful, like all these kind of things, that it can kind of just fabricate these things out of thin air, which I think, the more you examine that idea, the more it falls apart. And you don't even have to go metaphysical in terms of talking about our participation with God to come to that conclusion, right? You can just look at the ways in which, half your DNA came from, your mom and your dad. And so already, like, you're already in a certain sense, like, part of some larger living organism to begin with. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. And then, you're kind of joined culturally to all these different traditions and all these people you've come in contact with. And language itself is this sort of sort of DNA of human consciousness that you're deeply embedded in, and that frames the possibilities and choices you're making, and just even how you communicate with yourself, let alone other people.
Determines your imagination, your perceptions, even at some level. Yeah.
Right. So, and yet there is, there is this weird unity of consciousness that we do call an individual, which we all have an experience of and can't deny. And so it's like, how do you reconcile that sort of that feeling of being alone, deeply, alone, with this larger reality that we seem ensconced and connected to, and it's, I don't know, it's difficult to make that bridge. I think metaphysically, it makes sense to me, just, and again, I don't think about these things in very logical ways, honestly. I often, when I'm constructing my own view of the world, I feel like it's sort of intuited, and then when I'm looking at other people's arguments, I tend to see logical flaws. But when when I'm thinking about things, it's just sort of like this sort of intuition. But it seems to me obvious that we, on a moment-to-moment basis, our consciousness is somehow participating with God.
Yeah.
And that there's something integral there. And I especially notice that in watching other people have conversations, and the way they find interesting possibilities out of like seemingly nothing. It seems to me that we have, I don't know. It just seems obvious to me, because my background, my day job is like in technology. So like I know lots and lots of ways about how technology works, and more specifically how it often doesn't. And so if we were sort of like these information processing, things called brains, that just evolved, like none of the things we're doing in these conversations would make any sense whatsoever. And so there's something, I don't know. I just intuit that even now, like and especially where people are talking together, like God somehow seems to be in the middle of that. It is somehow facilitating some aspect of it.
Well, so
Um,
here's a bridge, I think, with what you're saying that I think makes sense to something that Cal was saying, even in conversation or in dialogue or what you were talking about. We're not just these, like the fundamental construction of reality can't just be material out of which consciousness emerges. Um, that's really not a real thing. It's just like a.
That's actually dualism, dressed up as monism.
Right. Yeah. It can't just be like some kind of um, secondary thing that is really not constitutionally real. But like even when you're walking around talking and you're saying we're not just brains that process information and facts, we really, or when you're seeing conversations with people, I think that's the point of what Langan talks about with UBT, but also I talk about all the time with Trinitarianism is like there's got to be what is the thing behind dualisms or what is the thing behind people? Like as we're talking, what is the thing that allows, what is this mystical, ineffable thing into which we are speaking?
What Langan would call the syntactic medium in which we are embedded. It is very left brain way of
Yeah.
conceptualizing it and articulating it, but that's exactly what he would call it.
well, I'm curious, how does Langdon conceptualize that syntactic network?
Well, he conceives God / ultimate reality as a conscious mind, embracing everything that is real.
Right.
And you ask,
But he's not a pantheist. He wouldn't say God is sort of the sum total of things, or would he?
he would.
Okay.
He said there's nothing outside ultimate reality that's real. Ultimate reality is all that is.
Well, but here's, I mean, I guess in the classical theism view, though, I mean, the big key differentiator is God kind of is immanent in creation, so he kind of he's in it through and through, but he's also beyond it.
Yes, so in Greek Orthodoxy, there's the Palamite panentheism, which distinguishes between God's essence and his energies. But in Langan's thought, you would not have really an ultimate distinction like that. Any distinction is situated in an underlying medium, which always and finally is God. Now, why does he describe that medium as syntactic? It is because for him, consciousness essentially, I could be wrong, but for him, it's like consciousness essentially reduces the language. Everything which can be understood and mapped in the mind reduces to language and thus bears description as language. If you think about consciousness, it is intrinsically syntactic. It is intrinsically to do with an exchange of meanings. And so that's why in his cognitive theoretic model of the universe, his big claim is that ultimate reality is a self-configuring, self-processing language.
So in some sense, God is just this sort of, I mean, would God have a will?
Yes.
But that will is just some sort of like, it's just some sort of, is it intentional, or is it just the kind of sum total of all that synaptic structure and kind of the directions in which it points?
You could ask the same question of yourself, assuming that the neural architecture of your mind in some meaningful sense, at least most of the time, in this simulation that we're familiar with, describes the architecture of your soul. Basically, the answer is, as far as I can tell, his conception of God is personal, where you understand a personal God, but of course in Christianity, you already have to qualify it, personal, super personal, tri-personal, all of the above. It's just a God with an intellect and a will. And so he's not an impersonal force. He is what you would call personal.
Okay.
At least this is my understanding. So I'm not there are no Langan scholars yet, and I'm not a scholar of anything. So you guys got to take what I have to say about his theories with a grain of salt.
Well, this is what I would love to, with either you guys or Michael. I was thinking particularly of you, but both of you, I would love to. Is I haven't even made all the way through it. I'm about 3/4 of the way through this Peter Rollins teaching on radical theology.
Mhm.
And it really is like it's a perfect example of why I love Rollins, but it's like everything is in there, like everything I want to talk about. Like he brings up so many things, and he is so gifted at articulation and bringing in pieces and stuff in a structured way. I think Rollins is hard because he's talking about things at a level that I think is the deepest that you can talk about it. So very few people I think understand what he's saying, but he to that point with Langan, he was bringing up all these different theologians and radical theologians, and sometimes we talk about Barfield, but there aren't people who are the forerunners in any particular field are. He said this explicitly in that lecture. He said they're talking about things that it reminds me of that McDonald quote that they barely understand. Like they're reaching into things, and so he said it takes almost sometimes generations before you get scholars and thinkers who really start to flesh out what they're saying because they're so
Right.
far out there. But I would love to do that with that Peter Rollins thing because he goes into a lot of this stuff in radical theology and being and non-being, because that's the thing with all this stuff. There was a connection point to what you were just saying with God and will and agency and stuff and personhood.
That's it.
I
Yeah.
think I think in order to have this gets tough even though too, but because there is something, I would say there almost has to be some kind of, well, I mean, ultimately, I think, and this is easy. I think ultimately you'd say it has to be love. There's some, and it's not even a desire necessarily. It's the reason that there is versus there is not, because God is beyond being and non-being even. Rollins talks about this a lot in radical theology. It'd be so helpful. We'll have to do that as a follow-up, but it's like a 2-hour thing. But he says like God is essentially, and we've talked about this, the singularity, the cosmic vacuum, this wealth of potential that then overflowed into, how did he say it? It was essentially that like even, because he talks a lot about lack and the loss of the sacred object. So he says even something like consciousness or awareness, what self-consciousness is intrinsically is a lack. What it is to be self-conscious is to realize you're not this. And so there's some immediate negation involved in self-consciousness. There has to be logically. And so like even creation itself is almost like God willing, how did he say it? Non-being. It's really hard to repeat Rollins. Rollins is one of the few like philosophers out there where I'm just like, I can't even hardly talk about the stuff he's saying.
If God is being, or if you prefer the ground of being, he does need a complement against which to be defined, which is non-being, which is why I think Langan's, as far as I can understand, Langan's idea is that being and non-being, or being and nothingness, or bound telesis and unbound telesis, that's what UBT stands for. Informational two-valued logic, informational constraint, and informational nil constraint. They exist biconditionally, such that if you have one, you always have the other. You know, because people ask like, why is there something rather than nothing? And the truth of the answer to this is that there's always both something and nothing. Without either one, you couldn't have the other. And for me, like the answer to the question of why is there something rather than nothing is that if what you mean by nothing is nothing unaccompanied by something, then that does not exist necessarily. And so if it does not exist necessarily, then the negation exists necessarily. But the negation of nothing unaccompanied by something is not something unaccompanied by nothing. It's actually the biconditional relationship of something and nothing, always, the two together. But you're exactly right, and you intuitively understand it, which is impressive to me, because I understood none of this before I actually was familiar with Langan's thought. You know, before I read and understood the CTMU, I was just like not a fedora tier atheist, but you know, pretty bad. Like
Well, that's because I mean, anyone can hear by just listening to you, like your kind of left-brained logical precision is there. But this is where, like, I think in order to make it palatable to most people, you
Indeed.
gotta you got to bring it down
You gotta, yeah.
to like a concrete level, which is what Michael's saying, which is like the intuitive knowledge. This is why I often, and this gets more at like my project as much as I can, like the intellectual project of my kind of noetic knowledge, or changing. I guess it's almost like an evolution of consciousness in changing. The problem is a vision problem, not an idea problem. It's about changing the way you perceive reality, which is why I like Barfield so much. Is that all the stuff we're talking about is not like let's just say for a thought experiment, it's all true. It doesn't matter if you can say it and talk about it. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant.
Hmm.
Like it matters if you live it. It matters if you do it. It matters if you if all this transcendent abstracted thought, it matters that you live rightly, whether or not you can understand it. It's kind of like that the whole thing that you were talking about before of like what is the matrix that all this is in and the relationship between us. And as you're walking around with the trees in the background looking like a Terrence Malick film, it's like all of that reality, if you live in accordance with that in a right way, like the immanence and the transcendence and all this stuff that we're trying to put language on, is you know it in the way
It is the Tao straight up. Yeah.
And I guess that's the thing that I probably rail against so much, is that, just to your point, Michael, of like why this stuff is important to me, is that the teachers and the intellectuals, I think, I mean, I don't know, to be slightly hubristic, aren't quite smart enough to realize that the answer isn't through a cognitive articulated propositional understanding of this stuff, because that doesn't matter. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you live rightly in with the world. That's the kind of knowledge that matters. The knowledge that, to tease out that line that I tried to say the other day, is like you can't see a thing until you know what it is, but you don't have to know what it is in the way that we're talking about it.
Yeah, what do they call that? Like knowledge by acquaintance or knowledge by presence? A kind of more intimate.
Well, what's funny, because both of those are true at the same time, right? Because you can't, like, I can't see this tree and really see it without knowing it's a tree. Like, there's something about that makes aspects of it alive to me that otherwise wouldn't be. But the same token, because I have this concept of a tree, it also can interfere with me seeing this tree, because I just kind of, I fill in, Jordan Peterson made this comment in one of his videos. He was talking about walking down the street kind of with his like his young son. He was making the point that this is one of the reasons why it's good to have kids, and why they pay back all the troubles they create, is because kids actually see the world in ways in which adults just simply can't anymore. Because for the adult walking down the street, all the houses are just icons of houses. They're not really, you don't see them anymore, because you assume, okay, yeah, I know it's there. I've looked at that house before. It's not interesting, but there's so much depth of detail there that you can't see, because you think you know what's there. You have a concept that fills in. And so it's weird. And this is like kind of back to the whole left brain, right thing, because like you're kind of having to go back and forth between those modes all the time to both take in the whole, but then also see the detail.
Yeah. Well, that's my vision. I guess that's kind of my Christian koans, as I call them, of like seeing subjectively, objectively, or like seeing the transcendent immanently. Because I think when you do that both, I think there's a way. Maybe that's a way to say it too. Like, I think there is a way to see and perceive the world, like at a level that's deeper than ideas. It's not even like it's deeper than worldview. It's fundamental apprehension, like figuration level, to bring in Barfield. I think there's a way to perceive reality that does both of those things at the same time. That isn't binary between one and the other switching, it's simultaneous. And I think
Yeah.
we do that with beauty intrinsically when we're really in touch with it. Like the waterfall being sublime, that's what we're doing.
Yeah, well, I think it's the whole thing. There's a great topic on beauty. We've probably talked about it before with Balthazar and beauty,
Yeah.
and how he kind of inverts the triad of truth, goodness, and beauty, and puts beauty at the top. And that, and there's something there, and I think beauty. One of the things beauty does kind of instantaneously is it evokes both gratitude and humility, both simultaneously. There's something about those two modes that do allow you to see in the way I think you're trying to kind of get at with what you're this sort of seeing, but also seeing through and seeing sort of depths of something while you're seeing.
Yeah, and I mean, to tie back to your whole, I think that gets us past the kind of every man is an island, not sorry, nihilistic individualism, where everyone is. It's a demon. He doesn't want me to say this, where everyone is so sad and disconnected and depressed, and the demythologized loss of sacramental reality with the world. I mean, that's what this is. And I think that's probably what I would call the egoic intellect, is when you live into that left side, all the houses are just static images, and you stop seeing, and you've lost your connection with the world. The world is no longer communion.
Because I guess it is dualistic in the sense that you have like these abstract icons from which you are standing apart, and you order them and you manipulate them. And I guess what the alternative is, this apperception or knowledge by presence or what have you, it's something like, in perhaps neuroscientific terms, there's the so-called default mode network, which is responsible for our sense of an ego. It's that sort of egoic chatter, like, oh, did I remember to lock the door? And sense of anxiety, sense of pressure. I, the agent and the doer, I need to do something. And when that default mode network goes down, be it through meditation or be it through the use of especially psychedelic drugs, then there is a sense of oneness, because there's not that sense of self and world. Now, a lot of people say, well, I became one with everything and I became God. For me, it's like, hold on, hold your horse. You're still in your own conscious bubble, but there's no, and God has a mind and an intellect of his own, a global consciousness, and he's in his. That's at least my way of conceptualizing it, and actually you're in his, and God is in yours, but it's complicated. But what I was going to say was, when that default mode network goes down, there's no longer a sense of sort of like, I'm separate from my environment, I as the self model, the ego. And then it's like, when you drink water, you become the water. You're just so focused on the experience. But like, whenever I'm driving and I need to make myself pay attention, I'm not really, however much I may speak this way, I'm not by nature like a Taoist or Eastern in terms of my sort of orientation toward the world. Although I love the Tao Te Ching. I think that's a beautiful book. But when I'm driving, I make myself think, become the road. Like, I want that kind of focus. And I think that's what it makes me think of when you guys talk about like this more sort of intimate or direct, realer way of being in the world, as opposed like to the kind of left brain, like this is my interface. I've got all my desktop icons here, and I manipulate them, and I make them go where I need them to effing go, and then I have control.
I think what it gives you is the peace that passes understanding. I think it's the thing that allows you to walk on water. I think it's what allows you to do greater things than these.
Yeah, yeah, or like when Morpheus tells Neo to just free his mind, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of well, two things. When you were talking about what's the network,
Default mode network.
default mode network. Yeah, that reminds me of a lot of Vervaeke stuff. Vervaeke was talking about that with mystical experience. That's what allows you to transcend the ego. But it also reminds me of C.S. Lewis in his space trilogy in Paralandra. Ransom, the main character, has, especially toward the end of the book when he's fighting with the unman and stuff and going through all these really just like Garden of Eden difficult things. He talks about the voluble self, the chatty self inside his head, which is that. It's that exact same thing.
Yeah.
But okay.
Meditators, they call it the monkey mind. It's like swinging
Yeah.
from branch to branch, brachiating.
But I think it's like, oh, Loris was the other piece. Is like one of my favorite lines from that book, that Eugene Vodolazkin book, is Arseny, the main character, or Loris. I mean, he has multiple phases. That book's brilliant. But he says at one point, his grandpa says to him, he's like, "Know this, O Arseny, that only he who does not fear drowning can walk on water." And I think that's what it is. It's like when you are at such a place of, and Christ actually, Jesus learned obedience by what he suffered. And even in Gethsemane, I mean, he was struggling. He was not yet, in some weird way, I mean, this will seem heretical, he was not yet perfect. He learned perfection by what he suffered. I mean,
yeah, it said he was perfected through his sufferings. That's somewhere.
Right. So then, but what is hard about that is like he was so, the high priestly prayer. I mean, he was so in tune with, I guess this is it, is the individualism. I think a lot of people talk in such a way that like their will and their agency and their choice and their education and their individualism, even within Christian circles, we talk as if that's the way. And I actually think the opposite of that is the way, is the death of yourself, the death of your agency, the conformity of your will to Christ. Not my will, but your will be done.
Way, wu way, right? The doing, not doing.
And I think that's what allows you to, that's where the peace that passes understanding will be found, where like you will, you're dying on a cross, Father, forgive them. This is really
the relationship between what one does and what God does. The whole synergism, monergism kind of dichotomy there. You would probably think it's a false dichotomy, but C.S. Lewis said for him, he summarized it with that verse: "Work out your faith work out your salvation with fear and trembling, because it is God who works it in you." It's like he's like, I just have to leave it at that contradictory verse because it's so hard. To get into, like, if I'm getting out of God's way, I'm or in the dance, or what's going on, like it.
See, that's a good verse. I actually, that would be a great one. That's the verse I want to talk to a Calvinist about, because I've heard lots of Calvinist sermons on that, but I think according to their whole system, they have to say that that's just like, that's a metaphor or that's a figure of speech. And I would just be like, I don't think it was the author.
What's interesting about you, and I'll say this and then I'll kind of yield the floor back to Michael, but one thing that I find interesting, there's a number of things that you repeatedly say, and I'm kind of just writing them down now. But this isn't something that you said, and I'm just going to paraphrase it, but basically, you have problems with the Calvinists because you think that there's something in their rationalist method that's leading them down a blind alley, and they have all these concepts, and they're going about it fundamentally the wrong way, and they're delivering a theology which can only, at least at first glance, appear to be evil. But you said like, ironically, you said unless you can steer them down the road of Barfieldian kind of base perception or direct perception or apperception or what have you, the solution is to get into like incredibly technical in-depth stuff, kind of like what Langit is talking about, where if you just crank the left brain into overdrive, then you can begin to see what you consider to be sort of more fundamental truth. Anyway, that's I think it's time to hear back from Michael.
Yeah, I don't have anything super interesting to add. Although, one of the things that I thought was going to come up, but we haven't chatted about, is about. Oh man, sorry, there's traffic in here. Is creation ex nihilo, and this idea in Orthodox Christianity that God creates from nothing. And I feel like one of the things that follows on from that is that ultimately God is morally responsible for everything. And I don't think that's taken all that seriously. But I don't see how you can get away from it, because it does play into this question of free will and God working in us and all this stuff. I don't know. Unless you posit one of two things. You either have to posit, that there is something outside of God that limits his actions, some sort of force that kind of resists his will in this process, which is not there in the Orthodox accounts. You have to posit something else that comes into the equation.
That's actually it's not monotheism anymore at that point.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think whatever free will we have has to come within the framework of God's choices. We can make choices, but they're within a range of options presented to us by God, right? And so ultimately, I don't see how you get out of God by orchestrating the options as such is morally responsible for whatever outcomes there are. I think David Bentley Harding kind of touches on this in the Show That Saved. But you do from the philosophical perspective, but I don't know. I don't see many people talking about it.
Let me respond to a couple of things you said, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Because you were talking about, because what you're getting on is something with which I fundamentally agree. I think that as long as God is in the equation, and even if he's not, there's no way in which you can see moral agents as ultimately responsible for their trajectories as moral agents. And you were talking about how God is, we make our choices, but God is the one who chooses what choices we have to select among.
Yeah.
And when the traditional sort of apologetic answer, to the problem of evil is that it's our fault. And because, we messed up when our great-great-great-grandparent ate the apple, and then we inherited guilt, which Hart says is already an oxymoron. But whenever I think of that scenario or that accusation, to me, it's like the Gary Larson Far Side comic where the passenger is on an airplane and he's on his chair and there's a bunch of buttons that do things like, recline your chair. And one of the buttons is the wings fall on / wings stay off button. And Fred is sitting in his chair and he inadvertently, presses that button and triggers disaster. And it's like, that's the point where the theologians jump in and say, see, it's your fault. But who put the guy on the plane? Who put the button there? And who made him dumb enough to press it?
Yeah.
At some point, you've got to get past this babyish sort of, well, it's not God's fault. Like as if God needs you to exonerate him anyway.
Yeah.
God's going to own everything when we die. And we ask God,
Right.
why did you do this and this and that? He's just going to own it. And he's well, I mean, if he explains himself at all. Well, isn't there that great C.S. Lewis answer where it's like, I now understand where you're silent because you yourself are the answer always. But it's like when I die and get to heaven, the theodicy is not going to consist in some subtle reconciliation among our contradictory notions. It's just going to have like all the assumptions and questions sort of swept out from under our feet, kind of thing. But yeah, no, that's what it made me think of when you talked about God as being the one who sets the choices. I have a kind of, well, if you guys don't know, I have like a podcast. I'm not going to just like necessarily plug it here. It has no listenership to speak of. But you can see from my hair is always so bad that I don't do YouTube videos typically. I do podcasts. And on my podcast, I talk about what you're talking about a fair amount, what I take to be the limits on human agency. Not that we have none to speak of, but that under any conception of agency, be it the compatibilist one, which is compatible with determinism, or be it the libertarianism one, which says that, in any given decision point, you can always choose otherwise. There's limits to our agency such that we can't be ultimately responsible for where we end up. And then my podcast, I go into kind of longer arguments. So what is essentially a simple argument, it can be stated in a few minutes, but basically, I agree. And that book, That All Shall Be Saved, is a fantastic book. As much fantastic for what it leaves unstated. Like David Bentley Hart considers some conclusions to be so obvious that he doesn't even bother to argue for them. And like for him, that's really one where he almost doesn't really argue for it. The idea that a finite moral agent can be infinitely liable for a finite moral transgression. He just describes it as sheer moral unintelligibility and just leaves it at that, like a gangster. Like, and it's like, I don't know why that tactic works so well. It shouldn't, like this like pure derision, but it does. So anyway,
the response to that is the Augustine like sins against an infinitely perfect God or punishment. That's which people just claim as if it's scripture. That's just something Augustine said, which may or may not be true.
Well, for them, it always comes down to like these monetary analogies, right? Like, of course, if you owe infinite sin dollars, then you need someone who has infinite sin dollars to wire those sin dollars into your account.
Yeah, it's all judicial and legal and
yeah, it's either financial or it's forensic / legal. Those are the only two metaphors, and neither of them make sense because at the end of the day, how is guilt and innocence like money?
well, but yeah, like an accountant or a father.
Yeah. It's but he is because he's getting humanity off the hook with this one weird trick where he issues this currency to himself to pay a debt that he owes to himself. I think you're on mute. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, it's just like he's at the IMF or something, and he's just doing some kind of financial wizardry, right? But the thing is, like, if you offend an infinite God, you get an infinite sentence. I love the analogy because it's kind of like the monetary analogy here is like specifically one to cars, where it's like, if you scratch an old beater, you don't have to pay anything. You scratch a Mercedes, now you're gonna have to pay.
How much worth? How many Mercedes is God worth of infinite Mercedes?
And is he not worth more than many Mercedes?
That's right.
That's what Jesus said.
Right. Oh man. Well, I'm gonna have to leave because my son has been wanting.
I'm gonna have to go too.
The candy that he bought at the gas station when he went out with his friend. May I throw it away or may I keep it? I'm gonna say throw it away because I'm a mean father. No, just kidding. No, but to close out, I mean, that's kind of my question that I still don't know. Like, what is a human being? And Like, what is this thing that chooses in opposition to God, chooses against the will of God? If everything somewhat you could think of as like a manifestation of the will of God, what is this thing that chooses in opposition to that? What is it?
It's seeking the good, but it's not the ultimate good because it doesn't know the ultimate good yet. What David Bentley Hart called the good sub contrario. But it's always aspiring. It's moving ever upward to higher and higher conceptions of the good, which is why kind of like Origen trading off like this old Socratic idea that no one knowingly does evil. And think about it, like if you knew that hell was the fate, like you knew it 100%, not kind of suspected it in this, in this simulation that God has put you in where there are like deliberate restraints on your ability to know stuff for sure. But if you actually knew that, taking some action was going to land you in hell, would you do it? No, because the wrong action, or if you did, you would just be insane.
Or if you understood the ramifications of your sin, truly, any of us, we wouldn't sin. Because because we would realize that's not worth it, because this is worse. And so you're not gonna willingly choose something that's worse for you.
And that's why Peterson says, who dares say that he believes in God? You don't act like it. You don't know it yet on some level, even though every day you're trying to convince yourself this is the case, this is how the world looks, and part of you just can't believe it, so you just keep doing the wrong thing. But if you truly knew that hell was your destination for doing X, and you did it anyway, you wouldn't be morally responsible for that. You would just be insane.
Hey, you guys want, or if you're still recording, you guys want to go through Radical Theology with me?
Which book?
It's not a book. It's a YouTube video.
Oh, this is the Rollins video.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to check it out. I thought the thing you sent earlier was Rob Bell.
I'll send it to you. It's a different thing. But that's what's so crazy is like the more I know, and I say this about Rob Bell and people get mad at me about it because people still have they have an image that walking down the street house conception of Rob Bell, which is terrible. They don't really see it for what it is. But the more, like when I go back and listen to stuff that he was saying, like when he was on tour for Love Wins and things, like he's not saying it as well as David Bentley Hart. I mean, he's not that smart, and he's not saying it as well as.
Well, he wasn't anywhere near as dogmatic as David Bentley Hart either.
No, and he just has a countenance that people don't like because he doesn't want to. I think it's because he's not playing the game. Like he's not doing the non-talking talking. He's like, I'm not going to answer your rhetorical question. Like I'm not doing this.
Yeah.
But which people just see as like some kind of slippery, progressive, slippery slope relativism or something. But like when you go back and watch his videos, I'm just like, that's a good point. Like what he's saying is a really good point. So
yeah, I'm down.
Okay, well we should make it happen because I really do think that video. I'll send it to you guys. I think I put it in the Discord, but I think it really, like, it's kind of like everything. It's almost like everything that Paul feels like he's figured out over the last 2 years and that people talk about. I'm like Rollins just like walks through step by step in that whole video. I'm just like, oh man, it's so good.
Well, I think Paul's going through these things slowly because he's trying to reconcile it with his own, current traditions that he's kind of forced to work within. So,
yeah, for sure. Thank you for all you do, Paul. Did you? Oh, by the way, his last video or whatever when he played some of your conversation, right, with Nate and Julian?
Mm-hmm.
Man, those were some of the highest praises I've ever heard out of Paul. He was just talking you up like crazy. Wow. It was good.
I like this whole YouTube talking thing is not really even something I'm super good at, but the reason it works well with like Karen and such is because like you just converse describes where my brain can go. And so like it kind of whittles everything down to a point. Like if you never ask me a particular question, like I just never feel like I know enough to actually say something meaningful. But it's like, okay, if you ask me a particular question, I guess I can, you know, flummox something, you know, passable. But otherwise, I'm just kind of like, I don't know, wandering endlessly trying to put things together.
Well, that's a tease for the other conversation I want to have with whomever. But and I think maybe Topher and Jess had this conversation, or we're going to. But it's kind of like it's about the community. It's the one that I've dubbed Rando Love, about this community, because there's so many of my personal friends. Number one, I think that I've developed meaningful relationships within this community, but also like I see so many different areas of gifting. I really think of that St. Peter, you know, God's expressions of God's varied grace. Like there are, and I mean, we're all kind of doing intellectual talking about stuff. That's kind of the nature of the beast, but different people have very different and special and unique skill sets, even within that, you know, thing that I can't do. Like I'm not very good at articulating things. Like I'm this, like my brain is this like crazy mosaic that like I just can't, and I just like as fast as I can, things are coming in. I'm just trying to point to them to just be like, can you see the picture? And I
Yeah,
can't.
I think you're much more clear than I am in terms of your communication and your ability to take like very disparate ideas and push them together. Like, um, I feel like my working memory is like such that I need I need a very small frame to kind of keep at bay all the. So I have enough, you know, the building blocks are small enough I can keep them in working memory and manipulate them. Um, I
I feel
think
like
you do.
that's more useful to most people. Most people find that more useful, and then you have really good illustrations and clarity. And then like Cal is like the most, like you're one of the most, you're such a philosopher. The things that you say, because like the kind of analytical precision that you like break things down with is just like I'm sure it's just. I often think of like I used to share these videos with my mom sometimes, and like she wouldn't even like this would be. You might as well just turn on static. Like it would just be complete nonsense. Oh, but
Yeah,
it's
well,
awesome. I love it.
as a philosopher, I used to think I was worth something, until, but I was still a materialist. And I'm not a philosopher. That's not my day job at all, and it's not even my training. Um, but you know, Kant said that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumbers, and for me, reading Langan was what woke me from my dogmatic slumbers. But when I read Langan, I realized, oh man, I don't have a tiny fraction of what this guy has. Um, but yeah, compared to most people, I certainly have more analytical precision. Although I have huge issues with working memory myself. I have ADHD in a very severe way. Um, but see, I'm already losing my train of thought. But I have more analytic precision than most people. But that's because I'm freaking obsessed with theology. I'm just that's going through my mind all the time, even when it shouldn't be. And that's just where I'm at. That's what I live. So.
All right, let's wrap it up. I got it. My son is being very patient. He's just
All right. Well, I'll send you guys a link from this, and we can decide to see if we want to. If there's any usefulness in sharing it or not.
nice. Well, thanks, Terrence. for all the
Awesome.
shots.
Happy New Year's, gentlemen.
Take care, guys.
Yeah, peace.
Bye.